everybody. It's Mr. Greg, and my program is called Music 123. During the time that we're not able to be together in person, I'm recording some of my music sessions for you, and this one is all about musical instruments. What they look like, what they sound like, and how they make that sound. If we look at instruments based on how they make a sound, then we can talk about three basic groups of instruments. Those that make a sound by making strings vibrate, like all in the string family. Those that make a sound by blowing air into them, like a trumpet or a flute. Those are called both brass and woodwinds. Both of those you make a sound by blowing air into them. And then the third kind is those that make a sound by hitting or shaking or scraping them. These are called percussion instruments and include things like drums and maracas and tambourines. The first group we're going to talk about today are those that make a sound by making strings vibrate. As we look at these instruments, you'll see that there are several ways to make the string vibrate, and that the sound is different depending on the length of the strings and how the body of the instrument is made. We'll also see that there are several ways to make the strings vibrate. We can pull a bow across them like a violin does, like this. We can pluck them with our finger or a pick, like a guitar, or we can even hit them with a hammer, which is what happens inside of a piano, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But before we talk about the specific instruments in this group, I want to show you in super slow motion what the strings look like when they vibrate. Let's take a look. Look at that vibration in super slow motion. That's what it looks like when those strings vibrate. And this is a violin. And he's pulling the bow across the violin, and that's what they look like when those strings vibrate. Kind of the same thing. And now he's going to pluck it with his finger. He's plucking it with his finger. The strings still vibrate in the same way. You can see them. So now we are going to get into some of the string instruments, starting with 4 of them that are in the that you would typically see in a symphony orchestra. The first thing you'll notice is that these 4 instruments have the same shape but different sizes. The strings are shortest on the smallest instrument, which is a violin, and they get longer as the instrument gets larger. All 4 of these instruments are played by pulling a bow across the strings to make them vibrate. And the bow looks just like this. Let's listen to the first one, the violin.
Violin.
So again, the bow he's using to pull across the strings looks just like this. Does anybody know what this bow is made of? And I'm talking about the white part right here. I'll give you a hint. Yes, you're right. It is made from the hair of a horsey's tail. It doesn't hurt the horsey when you cut the hair from his tail, but you can use it to make a violin bow. You pull it really tight, and then when you scrape it across the strings, it makes that sound. So let's look at the next one, which is a viola. Viola. Look, it's the same shape as a violin, it's just bigger, and the strings are longer, but she's using the same type of bow. She's making them vibrate in the same way, but the sound is a little bit lower because the strings are longer and the body of the instrument is bigger. Okay, and now with this next one, the strings are even longer. In fact, they're so long that the body of the instrument has to be so big to hold them that you can't stand up and play it anymore. You have to sit down to play it and rest the instrument on the floor. You pull the bow across it in the same way, but since the strings are longer and the body is bigger, the sound is going to be lower. That's right. Let's listen.
Cello.
Okay, the next one.
Double bass.
Double bass. He was just about to say bass when I cut him off. If we were fishing in the lake, this word would be bass, like a fish, right? But in music, this word is bass, and it refers to all of the low sounds in music. And this instrument, which has the same shape as the violin, is huge, right? The strings are very long, the body of the instrument is really big. In fact, look at the refrigerator. This instrument is bigger than the refrigerator, it's bigger than the guy playing it, and so when you pull a bow across those strings, what kind of sound do you think that's gonna make? Really low. Let's listen. Really low. Compared to all the other ones, very low. Okay. So now, I wanted to show you that all of the instruments that we've looked at so far are what's called acoustic instruments. And acoustic is the name for any instrument that you don't have to plug it in to play. You don't have to plug it into an amplifier, you don't have to plug it into a wall, it's not electric, and you can just pick it up and play it. Those are called acoustic instruments. That bass we just saw in the slide before this is an acoustic bass. This is the electric version. A lot of instruments have both an acoustic version and an electric version, and bass is one of them. This is the electric version of the bass, and the only way it makes a sound is if you have it hooked up to an amplifier through and the cord right here takes the sound from these strings and feeds it into this microphone, and then it goes through this cord into an amplifier. And a bass guitar is a lot easier to carry around than an acoustic bass, right? But the sound is a little different. Let's listen.
Guitar.
Okay. So now,
Harp.
harp. So a harp is a string instrument where she is plucking those strings. She's not using a bow, she's plucking them with her fingers. And some of the strings are very long and other ones are shorter. The shorter strings make the higher notes and the longer strings make the lower notes. Let's listen. Okay.
Piano.
A piano. Why is a piano in with the string instruments? Well, it's because if you look inside of a piano, what you're going to see is strings. In fact, it looks a lot like a harp inside of a piano, but the way those strings are made to vibrate is a hammer hits the strings. When you press a key down, there's a little hammer made out of sheep's wool, and it hits the string and makes it vibrate. And that's what makes the sound of a piano.
Acoustic guitar.
So acoustic guitar, remember, acoustic, that means we don't have to plug it in, we can just pick it up and play it, and we make the strings vibrate by plucking them. He's plucking them with his fingers. He's not using a pick, he's just plucking them and making them vibrate, and then the sound goes into this body of the guitar and then comes back out. And what kind of sound a guitar makes depends on how big that body is and what kind of wood it's made of. Makes a different sound too. So if there's an acoustic guitar, what kind of guitar do you think is going to be next? Right, it's an electric guitar. The electric version that you do have to plug in to play it. And it looks like that.
Guitar.
And this one would not make very much of a sound if you didn't have it plugged into an amplifier. Here's the cord right here. And these tiny little microphones right here, these silver things, pick up the vibration of those strings and send it through the cord into the amplifier, where you can create hundreds of different sounds and play it at any volume that you want. Let's listen to what the electric version of a guitar sounds like. Okay. And there it is. A banjo. So, a banjo has strings that are stretched across this white thing. That white thing right there is the top of a drum. It's the top of a snare drum. And so instead of the sound going into a wooden body like in a guitar and coming out, it bounces off the top of this drum head, and that's what makes that's what makes a banjo sound like it does. And what he's playing with right here are finger picks. This is a finger pick. So I'm picking the strings like this, and that's what he's using to make those strings vibrate. But what really makes the sound is them bouncing off the drum head, and there's no other sound like that. Okay, so now, the next instrument, which is an acoustic instrument also, is a mandolin. Mandolin has 8 strings, and you play it with a pick like this. This is a pick, either a guitar pick or a mandolin pick, and you pick like this. And it has 8 strings, and there's 4 sets of 2. And he's going to use the pick and play it very fast. Let's see what a mandolin sounds like. That kind of music is called bluegrass music. And in my session where we talk about different kinds of music, we're going to cover bluegrass music. So this next instrument is an ukulele. Some people call it a ukulele, but really it's an ukulele. And it comes from Hawaii. And the strings are made out of nylon, they're not steel. And it only has 4 strings, and it's pretty easy to play, especially for people with small hands and small fingers. So if you want to learn to play something that's pretty easy during the summer, this would be a great choice. Let's listen.
Ukulele.
They come in 4 or 5 different sizes. This is the smallest one. And of course, it's an acoustic instrument also.
Sitar.
Okay, a sitar. Look at how long these strings are. The strings are really long, and he is plucking it with his fingers to make the strings vibrate. And it has a very twangy, it has a twangy sound like that. And it comes from India. When I do my segment about music from all over the world, one of the countries we're going to visit is India, and we're going to hear more of the sitar. But right now, let's hear it. Pretty different kind of sound. Okay, so now we're going to talk about instruments that make a sound by blowing into them, right? So, and there's a number of different instruments that you play by blowing air into them. They have some kind of tubing, and they control how the air flows through that tubing in a number of different ways. So the first group that we're going to talk about is what's called the woodwind family. And there's a piccolo, a flute, a clarinet, an oboe, a saxophone, and a bassoon. And let's see what these instruments sound like.
Piccolo.
So a piccolo is very short. It's about this big. You blow into a hole. It does not have a mouthpiece. You just blow into a hole, and when you press these pads down, it controls how much air is coming out of it. So, but since it's very small, it makes a pretty high sound. The flute. The flute is the same kind of instrument as a piccolo. It's just a long tube with a hole in it right here, and you blow air across that hole, and then you press down the pads to control how much air is coming out of it, and that's how it makes a sound. But since that tube is longer than a piccolo, it's going to make a sound that's a little bit lower. Let's listen. Okay. An oboe is one of the instruments that has a reed. A reed is a small piece of bamboo that looks like this, and an oboe actually is a double reed instrument. So it has two of these, and when you blow on them, they vibrate to make a sound. Here is the mouthpiece right here. This is the part you blow into. Let's listen to what an oboe sounds like.
Oboe.
It's a very different sound, mostly because of that double reed that is in the mouthpiece. Okay.
Clarinet.
A clarinet. A clarinet is one of the reed instruments. It has a reed that looks just like this. You put it, it's in the mouthpiece, so you hold it there against your lip, and you blow in it like that, and when you do that, it vibrates. These pads control how much air is coming out of the big black tube that is a clarinet, and it sounds like this. Another name for a clarinet is a licorice stick. Okay, so
Bassoon.
the bassoon is the largest of the reed instruments, and in fact a bassoon, like an oboe, a bassoon is a double reed instrument. It has two of these in the mouthpiece that you blow on and make it vibrate. We're going to see the mouthpiece pretty soon, but a bassoon is pretty big. If it were sitting on the floor, it would be this big, and you can't stand up to play it. You have to be sitting down. Let's listen, and because of that, because it's so large, it makes a very low sound. Let's listen. Oh, pretty low. And the mouthpiece is right here. This is the part you blow into, and that's the part that has the two little pieces of wood that vibrate when you blow. Okay.
Saxophone.
Saxophone. So a saxophone is a reed instrument. The reed, this thing right here, the reed, is right here in the mouthpiece. It's right there, and he blows on that. The air comes down here, and these pads control how much air is coming out of the instrument. But it's a lot larger than a clarinet, right? It's the same kind of instrument, but a lot larger, so the sound is going to be lower. Let's listen. Now, so now we're going to go away from the reed instruments and talk about, and woodwinds, and talk about brass instruments. Brass instruments, you also blow into them to make a sound, but you blow into a mouthpiece that looks a lot like this. And that's how you make a sound in a horn. You put your lips like this, and you go like that. And that's how the air gets into the horn. But then once it gets in there, it goes around all these tubes, and you have to have a way to shut off the air to some of those tubes. Well, that is done in a couple of different ways. Some of them have what's called valves that do that, and one of them has a slide that does it and doesn't have any valves. Let's look at and listen to some of the brass instruments.
French horn.
So the French horn, look at all the tubing. I call this the spaghetti horn because there's so much tubing, it just looks like a bunch of spaghetti. And these things right here, though, when you press those down, they shut the air off to some of these tubes, and that's what makes different notes come out of a French horn. This is the mouthpiece to a French horn. Okay, a trumpet. A trumpet also has a mouthpiece, and it also has tubing, and it also has valves that you press down to control how much air is going through that tubing. And that's how it makes different notes. But since it's smaller than a French horn, the sound is going to be, right, higher.
Trombone.
Trombone. Trombone also has tubing. It also has a mouthpiece, but it does not have any valves. So how does a trombone know what notes to play? Well, if you look at this thing right here, and here, and here, and here, you see a slide. These are often called slide trombones because when you slide it out, it makes the tubing longer, and when you have it in, it makes the tubing shorter. When the tubing is shorter, it makes higher notes, and when the tubing is longer, it makes lower notes. Let's listen.
Tuba.
Okay, now the tuba. Look how big that thing is. There's lots of tubing. It has valves. It has a mouthpiece right here, but it's so big that this would not be a good instrument for you to play right now, but maybe someday. It's actually a fun instrument to play once you're big enough. But the sound it makes, as you might guess from how big it is very low. Let's listen. Really low. Okay. So now, the last group of instruments we're going to talk about today, they make a sound by either hitting them or scraping them or shaking them. They're called percussion instruments. And most of them, including the drums and maracas, they make a sound that we play in a particular rhythm, but that sound is not a specific note. These claves right here are an example. These are percussion instruments. You hit them together to make a sound. But that sound is not a musical note, it's just a sound. But there are some percussion instruments that do play a note. And like the xylophone is one of them. So let's look at a few of the percussion instruments in the percussion family.
Drums.
Drums. Okay. You're hitting the drums with the stick, but they're not making a particular note. You're just using them to keep a beat. But now,
Xylophone.
the xylophone is different. The xylophone, you hit these pieces of wood with this mallet. So that's what makes it a percussion instrument, because you're hitting something, right? But when you hit these pieces of wood, they do make a different note. They make a note, and the smaller pieces of wood the notes are higher, And the larger pieces of wood, the notes are lower, as you might guess from everything we've already talked about today. So let's listen. Yeah, it sounds something like that. Okay. So
Musical
so that is it for our lesson today about musical instruments. And I hope you all enjoyed learning about musical instruments and will also enjoy my other Music 1-2-3 videos covering different types of music and music from around the world. I am Mr. Greg, and if you would like to get more information about my programs, you can visit music123.org. Thanks for watching.